Good evening. My name is Harriet Harvey Horn. I am co-chair, along with the amazing Bonnie Hamilton, of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Climate Reality Project. On behalf of our chapter, I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event, another in our series of climate conversations featuring our presentations chair, Gary White, in conversation with sustainable business thought leader, Andrew Winston. We're excited to bring this opportunity to the community and are glad you're here. I want to note that this event is being recorded and will be available on the Climate Reality Bay Area YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks. I'll be turning the mic over to Gary and Andrew in just a couple of minutes, but first I want to share just a few brief chapter notes and announcements. First, per custom, we begin this evening with a land acknowledgement. With respect, we acknowledge the Ohlone, Miwok, Patwin, and other indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands we currently occupy in the greater San Francisco Bay region. This land acknowledgement helps remind us of the historic and ongoing oppression of the indigenous people and how the taking and occupying of indigenous lands and the exploitation of indigenous people and those lands is directly connected to the climate crisis, and how building relationships with and following the leadership of indigenous people here and everywhere is crucial as we seek and build long-term solutions to the global climate crisis. So next, I'll briefly share a little bit about the Climate Reality Project and the Bay Area chapter. The Climate Reality Project is an international nonprofit organization founded and chaired by former Vice President and Nobel laureate Al Gore. Mr. Gore founded Climate Reality in 2006, shortly after the release of his award-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, with the mission to mobilize a global grassroots network of climate advocates. Today, Climate Reality spans 170 countries with over 40,000 climate reality leaders around the world, trained by Mr. Gore to speak truth to power about the climate crisis and its solutions. Our activities are anchored in the Climate Reality Project mission to educate and inform the public, to use a climate justice lens for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in all we do, and to mobilize a grassroots network of climate advocates to take action that will lead us to a cleaner, safer, more prosperous, and thriving future. The Bay Area chapter is one of the earliest and largest regional chapters of the Climate Reality Project. We take our mission to the local level with almost 1,500 members catalyzing solutions to address the climate crisis and climate justice across 8 counties and the many municipalities within the Bay Area. With hundreds of local climate leaders trained by Mr. Gore and hundreds more committed community members, we are a tight-knit team taking urgent action to broadly adopt solutions to the crisis. Our goal is for the Bay Area and California to lead and serve as a compelling model of a regenerative future for the rest of the United States and the world. So without further ado, I'll turn the program over to Gary White to introduce our program and our speaker.
Okay, well, thank you, Harriet. I also want to welcome everyone to our special Zoom event. I'm anticipating an informative discussion this evening as we delve into the world of sustainability. Of course, if you have a question during the program, please type it into the chat. Now, earlier in my work in high-tech companies in corporate social responsibility, I read an informative book about, at that time, the nascent field of sustainability, which was called Green to Gold. It was co-written by an author that I was not familiar with, Andrew Winston. 7 years later, in nearby Los Altos, I met Andrew at a conference for climate leaders from around the world. Since that chance meeting and getting to know him, I've made it my business to read every article and book Andrew has written on the evolving subject of corporate sustainability. Now, let me tell you just quickly about Andrew. Andrew is a globally recognized expert on megatrends and how to build companies that thrive by serving the world. Named to the Thinkers 50 list of the top management thinkers in the world, his views on strategy have been sought after by leading companies, including 3M, DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, Kimberly-Clark, Marriott, PepsiCo, and Unilever. Now, in addition to Green to Gold, Andrew has also written another bestseller, The Big Pivot. His latest book, however, just recently published, Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, co-authored with the renowned former CEO, Paul Polman, has been named one of Financial Times' best business books of the year. Net Positive has been called an electrifying strategy for business success, and unlike any other book you've read, by Merck chairman Ken Frazier. It was also called, quote, a wonderful rallying cry, end quote, by Sir Richard Branson, and quote, pure heresy, end quote, by Arianna Huffington. It was also described by Climate Reality's very own founder and chair and former US Vice President Al Gore as, quote, a compelling and inspiring case that businesses can and should boost their bottom lines by contributing to their communities and protecting the environment. Lastly, Andrew is a respected and dynamic speaker, reaching audiences of thousands at executive meetings around the planet. He received degrees in economics, business, and environmental management from Princeton, Columbia, and Yale. So I'd like to welcome Andrew Winston and thank him for taking the time to join us from his home back in Connecticut for tonight's edition of Climate Conversation. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. That was a lovely introduction.
Right. Don't let it go to your head.
Yeah, that was the long bio. I appreciate you taking the time.
No problem. Well, let's just sort of kick off the conversation, Andrew. First thing I'm curious about is how and why did you first get into corporate sustainability as a professional career?
Yeah, I mean, I in a way fell back into it like lots of things. I mean, I'm glad the Presidio folks are here. I talk to students a lot and they ask about life path. And, I kind of tell them that I don't think anybody usually follows an exact path. There's just way too many, twists and turns. Long story short, my shift into this world came from being unemployed. I worked in the media business at big companies and then went to a .com in 99. And basically I got there like weeks before the market crash, like the .com crash. So, we lasted for another 8 months or so, and then we were done. And I had recently gotten married and had realized I had someone who could pay the bills for a little bit, which was totally novel, and decided to kind of find a passion. I'd been doing strategy and business and marketing and branding, and I liked it all, but it was, there was something kind of missing, and I didn't really have the language. So I started asking around and figured out there was this thing called sustainability and started reading, really the kind of canon of early sustainable business, like Ecology of Commerce and Ray Anderson's book. Mm-hmm. And, just kind of went through those and realized I had to do something different with my life, and ended up back in school at Yale to do an environmental management degree and started writing and working with a professor there, and it led to Green to Gold. And I didn't really know what I'd do after that. I agreed to go write a book for a year, and it took us 3. So that took up some of my time. That took up the first, few years of my, first kid, and who's now, 6'3" and in college. So I've been doing this for way too long. So, I came out and didn't know what would come of it. And then people, started asking me to speak and paying me to speak, which I didn't know was a thing, and consulting. And I've just had my own business for the last, 16, 17 years. Every year I think it can't continue. And then I somehow pull together a year of income and business. And, I love what I do. I really was never cut out for the big company thing. I did that as the first part of my career, and I just really didn't like it. It was just too structured.
Very cool path. Very cool path. One of the things that I realize, and I think other people do as well, there are so many different terms in this area of study. And can you help us determine and tell us the difference between, let's say, corporate social responsibility, sustainability, and there's even a new thing, ESG. What on earth is that?
Yeah, and now net positive. I mean, that's there's net zero, there's versions of net, and then Paul and I are kind of pushing the net net positive idea. And then there's also regenerative. Those are kind of the really big words these days. It's funny, I'm writing a article that I haven't decided what to do with about kind of the rapid dominance of ESG as the phrase. It's become almost the only one. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the main one is that it came from the finance world. And so ESG, environmental social governance, was really about investments. Like funds used to be called socially responsible investing, but it was really kind of this investor lens. And because investors are finally at the table after years and years of kind of poo-pooing the whole thing and thinking it wasn't about real business, they're finally there asking questions. So it's turned into the language we use in business, which I don't totally love, because it actually, ESG doesn't say anything. It's just categories, like environmental and social. It's, to me, it's like saying HR is human resources. That doesn't tell you anything about your people strategy or whether it's innovative or who you're hiring. So it's just it's just an acronym versus words like corporate social responsibility, whether you like it or not, has some meaning. Sustainability has meaning. Positive has meaning. Regenerative has meaning. So I think we've kind of lost something, but ESG is certainly the term now. It's for many years been sustainability. Corporate social responsibility is kind of an old school thing. It's closer to philanthropy in most companies. It's a fairly dated way of talking about what you're doing, and it really was kind of a sense that companies had a responsibility to do well, do some things that were good for society, but not as an integrated part of their business. And it was really like, you go do the tree planting day on Earth Day, or you have your staff, do UNICEF or something. It was very kind of narrow. Sustainability, I think, has really broadened that, and it has a definition, came out of the UN, and, it means fundamentally being able to keep doing what we're doing and provide for the future, and at the same, quality of life or better than we can provide today. And it's clearly what we're not preparing for and not doing, because we're diminishing the capacity of the Earth. But sustainability has also got this very it's like, just as my friend Hunter Levin says, it's just keeping your nose above water. Like sustainability is like, you can just literally survive. That's sustainable. It doesn't really give you kind of a journey. So I think regenerative is really big now, and that says we have to heal. And that's the same message as net positive. We're using it as fairly interchangeable with regenerative. I think words matter. I do. I think in business, I've gotten a lot of blank stares with the word regenerative. So, we picked the title of the book, Net Positive, really and very carefully, because, like green to gold, I think we have to be pretty simple about messaging and just tell business, this is good for business. This is, creating a positive impact on the world, and just start that conversation. And then you can get to, now, how do you build a regenerative supply chain in food? Or how do you, you can start having more detailed conversations. So I'm sure plenty on the call have their own views of what those words mean, but that's kind of where I think it's at right now.
But that's very, very helpful, because, for instance, 25 years ago, I was at Intuit, company of Quicken financial software, and I was the head of corporate social responsibility. And that was trending at that particular point. But one of the confusing things is that so many different companies are using so many different titles. But it's also an indication as to where they are in their evolution toward sustainability. To see.
I think Holly in the chat mentioned resilience, also, important word. We talk about that in the book. Thriving, flourishing, those are all really, really key words. And I see Alan said something about there's a lot of greenwashing with ESG. But it's funny because I see so much criticism of ESG, but my point is that ESG actually conveys zero meaning. Like it's not necessarily incremental or systematic. It's just an acronym.
It's just a category.
It's just a category. So it doesn't really tell us anything. But I think what's happening is, I think in the investment community, there's a lot of, look, we're doing ESG. And then it's, turning out that the definitions behind that of how they're deciding which companies to invest in under that are completely made up, or opposite, like actually are pulling companies into a fund that arguably are more damaging because they've defined it in some way. Like it's the Wild West right now, and there's regulations and transparency coming down, like especially in the EU, where and the SEC has put out a warning about, someone calls it an ESG fund, doesn't mean it's actually doing anything for the world. So I think that's all good. I mean, like, you need to work these things out. You know,
Well,
you need to work them through.
I think it's great that the investment community and large fund managers are really picking this ball up and running with it with ESG. That really helps. You know, one thing that I was thinking about the other night, in lieu of this Ukraine invasion by Russia, that there is a lot of worry and consternation in the ESG world about what this means for funds and how do they divest from Russian interests. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's even gotten weirder than that. If you've seen, there's been some arms makers making the case in the last week that they should actually be put back into ESG because they're defending a democracy.
Wow.
And there is a certain logic to that, right? I mean, I've heard, but then someone else was joking after, I can't remember who it was joking about that and saying, well, yeah, I guess you should put tobacco back in because cigarettes are relaxing. And, some people have less stress in their life because of it, which is true.
Yeah.
But, it's kind of the same kind of thing. Yeah, in the short run, I guess giving Ukraine arms is necessary. But, so there is a lot about what does this really mean? And who's deciding? Is it a carbon footprint based view of ESG? I mean, like, what is it that we're really asking for in those investments? I mean, I think it's good that we've moved away from what was a very blunt instrument, which was this category good, this category bad. And, and then there were the years of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and those kinds of things that ranked companies within sectors. But that's starting to fade as something useful because people are realizing there isn't a sustainable fossil fuel company. Like there just isn't. Their only plan that makes sense is to actually sunset their core business, is to become something else. Then they have a future. But to call them more sustainable because they use a little less energy in the production of fossil fuels is surreal, right? I mean, so we're in a really weird time, clearly. But I think for me, what's, I think, there's lots to be pessimistic about. I mean, this war is serious. I mean, this is like global history, DEFCON 1 kind of stuff going on. It's just a pure flat out attack on democracy, which Putin's been waging for many years digitally. I mean, he's arguably brought the US to its knees by misinformation, leveraging Facebook. I mean, all of it. But what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, the pandemic really sped things up. But what's happened is, I think more has changed in what's expected of business and the role of business in society in the last 2-3 years than in the 20 I've been doing this. It's just sped up so radically. The pandemic was part of it. The murder of George Floyd just took, racial equity right to the top of the CEO's agenda. And just all these mega trends that I've been kind of focused on for many years and trying to help companies see, they're now not theoretical. Like climate was a model that people were debating, and now it's a reality. It's like an expense in your supply chain, or it's taking out entire communities. It's real. And so I think that's why you're seeing basically every company's at the table now. The largest companies,
more expected.
They're all now having the conversation. There's greenwashing. A lot of them don't really know what they're saying, but nobody's out there saying this is all BS. No one's saying we shouldn't talk about sustainability. They know they have to.
That's really encouraging, because that was not the case, obviously, 25 years ago when I was.
No, I mean, that's been a huge change. But look, we could talk whether we're optimistic or pessimistic. I mean, the bottom line is emissions are still going up if we just want to use the one metric.
Yep.
So we're still losing.
True.
Counterfactually, we're doing better than we would have probably because of all the efforts of everyone on this call and everyone working in this field, but we're still losing. And that's kind of scary. And that was, in a way, the main impetus for me and Paul to write this, was that we need to go much faster. We need a much larger scale and much faster.
Andrew, one other quick question before we dive into your new book. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of sustainability?
I'm sorry, I'm also just reading Alan's. I mean, we should, maybe have a conversation about ESG, as he's got a long experience in this. I see that, they're, yeah, I mean, yeah, environmental social governance. Anyways, we could talk about that. Look, I think the most misunderstood is some version of that, it costs more, that it's always anti-business. You were asking me before, do I do a lot of these, between interviews, podcasts, talks I give, I mean, over the last 15 to 20 years, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of interactions. And if it's not a sustainability event or a sustainability conversation, and I'm talking to a regular journalist or whatever, I get some version of, well, it's hard for companies to do this because it's more expensive. I get that not sometimes, every time. Like, I mean, literally every conversation, there's some version. I can speak for an hour showing how much value is created in sustainability and come off stage, and someone raises their hand and says, yeah, but it always costs more, right? And, so it's not just a misperception. I mean, it's almost a willful kind of definitional problem that, we're in the middle. I mean, we're 50 years into this narrative, the Milton Friedman economic neoliberal model that says business is just supposed to maximize shareholder profits. Countries are just supposed to maximize GDP and the stock market, and that's it, right? And because of that, sustainability has always been considered anti-business. Even frankly, Al Gore, commie, liberal. I mean, that's literally what you would hear. You don't hear it as much directly, but it's still under the surface, and I still get those questions. They're like, again, everyone's at the table. They know they have to do stuff now, but they still think it's going to hurt their business, and it's really strange. It's increasingly surreal to me because the things you can do under the sustainability banner, there's many that pay off very quickly, including now renewable energy. But there's no other category in business that we call an expense. Everything's an investment. Everything's a capital choice. You're doing marketing, or you're doing R&D, or you're paying for people. There's no something that you put money out and it pays you back in a minute. Like, there's nothing. And yet for sustainability, it's always got this burden. So
it's interesting. It's interesting that kind of journalist, as you were mentioning, kind of parrot the philosophy of probably the most laggard companies of all, and haven't really caught up with the understanding of that sustainability can be a positive thing for the company, not just for society.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right.
Let me dive into the new book. Your new book is called Net Positive. Define the title for us.
Yeah, so the way Paul and I are defining it is that a company that's net positive, and let me just say quickly before we get off the previous conversation, that conversation that it's more expensive, I was answering the myth in corporate responsibility. I'm sure that you're dealing, as you go to talk to people about climate. I mean, the line you hear still very regularly, from the anti-climate action folks, like senators, is acting on climate will destroy the economy. So, I mean, the climate change discussion is the same one. It's just not at the capital choice of a company. It's at the investment and capital choice of the country. Like when we talk about trillions need to go into the clean economy switch, it's not like it's trillions down the drain and burned. It's like trillions to build an entirely new grid or EVs. And I mean, like you're left with something like an infrastructure that's better and cleaner and healthier. It's like, it's always put in these terms of look how expensive it is, always. And it's so strange because there's nothing else like that. There really isn't. So we define a net positive company as one that profits and grows and has all the normal things that make a company successful by solving the world's problems, not creating them. And we ask kind of a core question, which is the world better off because your company is in it? That's the underlying question in the book. And at a more detailed level, it means that a company's creating well-being for all its stakeholders through everything it does, every product and service, every facility, every country it operates in. And this is, it's a North Star. There's nobody there. We're not claiming Unilever is. Nobody could be. The systems aren't in place, right? Again, there's no grid that's 100% renewable. So you can't plug into a grid and have a net positive impact. But it helps set the agenda. And the companies that are starting to think this way are thinking much bigger, because at the core, for a company to be net positive, it has to work in partnership, in sometimes very deep, complicated partnerships with peers, with civil society and NGOs, with governments, to solve really big problems together. That's kind of the heart of the story.
Andrew, can you dive in a little deeper and tell us what are some of the key elements necessary for a company to move toward becoming net positive?
Yeah, so I mean, we lay out what we think are kind of 5 core principles. In addition to principle, there's other principles to say this is what makes a good company, but we tried to find what are the things that really kind of would distinguish this model. And the core of it all really is the first principle is taking ownership. It takes the word responsibility from the old CSR and says responsibility more in the sense of, what we teach our kids. You break it, you own it. And we have responsibility for our impacts, as a business throughout the value chain, from suppliers to customers and end of life of products, that we have responsibility for that and all those impacts, whether they're intended or not. And, and their impacts on all stakeholders. And if you're a big multinational, arguably that's everyone. That's the whole planet, right? That you have some relation to. So that's the core idea. And it requires thinking in a much broader way. There's also taking a long-term perspective, because you have to fight the short-term pressure from Wall Street. There's this multi-stakeholder view. It's not just shareholders. You're out there to serve customers and employees and suppliers and communities and more. And that the shareholders do well because of that they're after that. They're not the focus. But again, we're not saying this is sacrifice for business. We think this is actually the only path to success in the medium and long term for business. There's not going to be a model that doesn't have some element of this for companies. There's just no one's going to want to go work there. They're not going to get customers. It's the only path. And so shareholders will do well, but they come after. And then, the 5th principle is really about partnership. As I said, it's believing and kind of seeking out transformative partnership. And then you need leaders that are kind of structured a little differently and have much more humanity, empathy, humility, kind of bring a much deeper humanity to business. And first and foremost, really have courage, the courage to tackle the status quo, and say, hey, I'm not going to worry about quarterly profits right now. We're going to do what's needed for the short, medium, and long term. So it's a lot of things.
Sure. In the book, you discuss a number of companies that are currently taking innovative steps to lower their carbon footprint and become net positive. But tell us about a few of the most impressive companies that you've come across and what they're doing.
Well, look, a lot of the books about Unilever, probably half the stories, because it's, written by the former CEO. And that's a large part of the value add, I think, of this book, is that it's real. It comes from, inside, making change happen. So there's a lot of really, really great examples across the spectrum, good and bad, like successes and failures. There's plenty of things that, didn't go right for Unilever. Look, there's company, like I said, there's nobody that's net positive yet. Nobody could say they're sustainable, but there's companies doing, pieces of it really well that you can kind of point to. There's ones that, are really managing carbon in an incredibly strategic way. IKEA generates more energy than it needs through renewables. It has literally net positive. It's putting more on the grid. It's trying to sell to consumers, sell them solar so they can kind of expand that footprint. Out where you guys are, out on the tech world, Microsoft and Google both have the most aggressive carbon goals around, really, where
Microsoft even wants to go back a few years.
Right. No more. Yeah. They're going to offset all the carbon they emitted since they were founded.
Wow.
1975. Like that's like Pong level. That's how long ago we're talking about, for those of you my age, you remember Pong. And, Google, they're both doing similar things, but Google talked about a year or two ago, came out with this goal to use basically only green electrons in their operations, meaning they're not buying a solar field down the road. They're only operating on green, which means on-site storage, and then having to change the grid they plug into, which is where you get into the systematic change. They have to go deal with the community, with the government, with everything. And so those are the ones kind of thinking really forward. Again, there's companies working on kind of pieces of it that are doing really cool things. Companies like Novozymes and these companies that are making things that make things much more efficient or much more interesting. There's Apple's been working with suppliers on new kinds of aluminum that are almost zero carbon, which could change one of the most energy intensive industries around. So there's just all these examples of it happening in kind of pieces of the story. And we need to kind of get to the systemic view where they all interact. And that's, obviously more complicated. I mean, the E, S, and G are all interrelated, right? Climate is, the big issues we talk about in the book are fundamentally climate and inequality. And there's, other existential threats, but that's the kind of overarching kind of simplified view. And they're interrelated, like deeply interrelated, right? I mean, inequality, leads to kind of misuse of resources and land and emissions, and climate's going to hit the poor far harder than the rich. I mean, it's just, it is a issue they're completely wrapped up in each other. So it means approaching things in a much more systemic way.
One thing I just recently read that only a third of more than 13,000 companies surveyed have credible emission reduction targets. This is according to a report released about a week ago by the nonprofit CDP. I don't know if you've seen this.
Yeah.
They go on to state that fewer than 10% have independently validated science-based targets.
Yeah.
I guess the ultimate question is, what will it take for more companies to integrate sustainability into their operations and their different scope emissions?
Yeah, I mean, the percentage or the number of companies with some form of science-based carbon goals is a perfect example of how far we've come and how far we have to go, because there were no science-based carbon goals 6-7 years. There were a handful. Walmart had 100% goal, P&G. There were a handful, like literally you could count on a couple hands. So the fact that, 20, it depends on who's measuring, 20, 25%, say, of the largest companies in the world have something like a science-based target on carbon is so much better than it was, but it's actually terrifying that it's still that low, right? I mean, I started writing about science-based targets in my last book, so like 8 years ago, and I got a lot of pushback, from people saying, why would a company set a science-based target? It has nothing to do with whether it makes sense financially for them. It's just based on what the world needs. And I didn't have a much more complicated answer to why would they do that than because we have to. Like, it's just we're having a stupid argument in many ways. Like the whole system is coming down. So we all have to kind of take our part of it and then compete and figure out the cheapest ways to do it. We can't go, oh, we'll figure out later whether we can do that. There's just no time for that. So I think it's surprising to me that we're still maybe as low as we are in that percentage. And so when you say what's it going to really take to accelerate this? Well, I think we're in the middle of that kind of tornado, the crossing the chasm kind of language. There's like the early adopters are past, we're moving into mainstream, and where everyone's going to have some form of aggressive carbon target. And they're going to have to, because they're getting pressure from various stakeholders. So companies are asking their suppliers to set science-based targets, so it ripples back. Investors are now asking through the ESG lens, like, what's your climate risk? What are your goals? And, I think possibly the biggest pressure of all on most companies now is the younger workers and consumers, the young millennials, the Gen Z. They are just have a much clearer view that business should be acting in the public interest in addition to its profit-seeking ways, and that they have to tackle, climate. I mean, there's surprisingly high percentages in surveys of the younger folks who think companies just have to be acting on all these issues. They have to take a lead. So I think
the contrast between the generations right now is amazing. The younger people are really pushing this forward.
Yeah, it's they have a clearer view that it needs to be part of it. And they're coming into power, right? They're getting the older millennials are getting towards 40. They have management positions, like they're getting to be more and more senior. And Gen Z is entering the workforce and has, in this time right now of like the low labor availability, they have a lot of power, right? To say, I'm going to go to a place that has a purpose, that shares my values. I mean, the contract between companies and workers died 20, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There were decades and decades where big companies like IBM, my father worked there for 35 years. He has a pension, which is just like the craziest thing, right? Like, who has a pension anymore? there was a lifetime deal, right? We're going to get you set up and, you work hard. And that's gone, right? The CEOs who were praised in the 90s and 2000s were firing people, right? It was like, so should we be surprised that a generation that's grown up entirely in that mindset is going to come and work kind of at will? Like they're going to work where they want to, and nobody's guaranteeing them anything. So
Absolutely.
I think it's going to drive a lot of change. I see someone said they have a pension. Good for you. There's
That's one of 50.
So few of them. I mean, it is wild. I mean, it's actually made his retirement just a completely different animal than other people. I mean, he lives off his pension. It's just amazing. I mean, he did spend 35 years there, but
Andrew, most of the people on this call work for large companies, many here in the high-tech industry in the Valley. What actions do you think they can take within their companies to promote sustainable practices within their own companies?
What actions can
the individuals take within their companies?
Yeah, I mean, it varies kind of by level, I suppose, but I think there's a way to be a change agent, in many ways. And I think, look, I mean, all sustainability executives and managers for years and years, they've really only been influencers. They're given almost no money and very few people. And it's all been about kind of a matrix and influencing kind of from the middle out or middle up. And I think it depends on kind of where you are in the organization. The younger, the newer people, they can ask questions, and they do. They ask questions while they're being interviewed to come there. They can ask questions when they're new. They can pressure their managers on why aren't we doing X, Y, Z? I think their voices can be heard. I think in the middle, it's like all entrepreneurship. You really need to you have to find a way to kind of gather like-minded people and try to set goals in a way that drive, more group behavior. And I think part of it is looking for partnerships and looking for outside companies, civil society, other ways to get at some of these problems, and try to help the organization get comfortable with those kinds of partnerships. But it varies just so greatly. I mean, obviously the senior guys, the CEO and the C-suite can set the agenda, but they also need to change the metrics. They really need to change the culture too, and not just say, oh, we want to be responsible or we want to be net zero, and then not change anything about the metrics that they're sending down or what they're incentivizing people to do. And I think a lot of it is challenging the short-term pressure and trying to have a conversation that's about the longer term and about the value you're creating in long term. I just saw a question from Audrey that I do want to get to at some point when you're ready, Gary, about fiduciary responsibility. It's a really interesting thing. Fiduciary responsibility, I don't think it's written anywhere that fiduciary responsibility equals maximizing shareholder value in the quarter. There's no definition like that. Fiduciary responsibility means that you are a representative as a company manager or a fund manager of someone else's money and someone else's wealth, and you have to manage it responsibly. But there's a lot of leeway in the law for business judgment. If it was just maximizing in the short term, you do almost nothing like R&D. You do nothing for the longer term, right? And you see companies who have done that who sacrifice the long term, and they end up in trouble. We opened the book kind of comparing Unilever and Kraft Heinz, which tried to take Unilever over 5 years ago. And it was still is owned by 3G, a private equity firm that was all about cost cutting. And the models were just so different. And they really went in two very different directions over the next 3-4 years after Unilever kind of fought off this takeover. And it eventually it gets to you. If you keep cutting costs to maximize the short term, you will fail, right? Sure. You can't do that forever. So it is a myth to maximize profit in the short run. It's also a myth that shareholders are the only stakeholder. It's just, that's not written anywhere. That's not actually written as a law. That's a designed system, that came out 50, 60 years ago from economists that said, this is the best way, market-driven, shareholder-driven. So it's partly a time horizon question, but it's also a question of, what do you think the purpose of a business is? Is it just to create money? If so, you could do literally anything. It doesn't, but so the real purpose has to be something, as simple as, well, what is it you do for people? A company solves a problem for somebody in some way, right? They find a customer and they satisfy them. That's the basic definition of a company. And we've gotten pretty far off of that to say the purpose of a company is shareholder maximization. Because then I don't know like why you would choose to do any one thing over the other, right? Everybody would just, I don't know, sell crack.
Sure.
I mean, like there's no reason to do anything else. So I think it's always been an incredibly strange way to talk about a business. Paul likes to say that you need, white blood profits or cash flows like white blood cells. You need them to live, but if you're living for white blood cells, something's really going wrong, in your life. And so we just need a much broader view of what the well-being of a business is, just like the well-being of people.
Sure.
We've boiled that down to money too. And is that working? I mean, it's
Andrew, let me ask you one more question
Yeah.
before we open it up to the audience and check the chat. What do you think companies can actually learn from activists and NGOs in the climate movement that would help them advance their own climate agenda?
Yeah, look, we actually talk, we borrowed a little bit from some writings from the Extinction Rebellion founders. And, late in the book, we talk about scope 1, 2, 3 for emissions, and then thinking about scope 4, 5, 6. And the Extinction Rebellion guys had written about that, and others too. And we kind of played with it and kind of ran with it, that there's just larger responsibilities. I think NGOs in general, they keep companies honest, they are pressuring them. But I think there's a role in often bringing real knowledge and science and understanding of particular issues. And we talk in the book about working with your critics, inviting them in, being transparent and open. Not with this, we distinguish between critics and cynics, the people who just say all business is bad and just want to come in and tell you why you're awful. That's not really productive. But there's NGOs and activists who have knowledge, who know how to mobilize, know how to make change happen, and that companies should really be listening to, and are thinking about and protecting the common good, which is, part of the argument is we need companies to be taking that on as well, because they are part of the common good. There's no company without, the bottom line, and I kind of end all my talks with some version of, that companies can't thrive unless people and planet are thriving. Just that basic idea. I think the NGOs are the mouthpiece for civil society to remind everyone of that shared common risks and opportunities. That we are in this together. And this is probably the biggest problem we face right now, is that we don't seem to think we're in it together. We couldn't even get everyone to get vaccinated for each other or wear masks for each other, in the most basic of life-threatening situations. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be uncovered here.
Well, we could go on and on. I would love to, but we now need to get to the questions from our audience. And my climate reality colleague, Marty Jordan, has been tracking questions in the chat and will pose them to us. Marty, are you there?
I am.
All right.
How much time do we have for Q&A?
About 10 minutes.
Okay.
Let's do lightning round. I'll try to be quick.
Yeah, really. Well, good luck with that. So one question is, in your book, do you discuss how corporations can play a positive role in influencing policy, pushing legislatures to adopt climate-friendly policies? Yeah,
that's actually kind of the big thing in the book, because we build to partnerships, and then we talk about the kind of partnerships companies can do with peers, with their suppliers to, optimize or improve efficiency or find solutions together that are kind of in a way optimizing within the system. And then we talk about the kinds of partnerships that change the system. And the fundamental difference is really having the government at the table and changing policy. So we write about what we call net positive advocacy, where a company isn't just going to DC and Brussels and other capitals and asking for a tax break or some accelerated capital tax thing. They are looking for the systemic solutions, going in with NGOs and with peers to talk to government about how do we solve this all together. So we we have some examples of that. There's not many, but there are some that are working. So it is a huge part of the story in the book is how do you take a better role in policy? And it's something I've been writing about more and more for the last few years because, and we talk also about the situation with companies and their trade associations, companies staying silent. This happened with Build Back Better. Companies just stayed silent while the Chamber of Commerce killed it, worked hard to kill it. So you had companies with huge sustainability goals, huge carbon goals, the auto companies, and then letting their trade association through their silence kill a bill that would have helped them reach those goals. Like
Why'd
lots
they do
of
that?
money.
Why'd they do that?
Because it was going to, saying this out loud sounds so stupid, but because it was going to roll back the tax breaks they had gotten in the Trump administration. It was kind of that simple, right? Like, because they believe that their fiduciary responsibility is to maximize profits no matter what, in any time frame, they believe they are doing something wrong if they support something that might actually raise taxes on them to build the common good infrastructure. And what's craziest is that the auto companies have all committed to selling only EVs in 10, 15 years. The only way that happens is if there's massive infrastructure. Like, I have an EV and a hybrid. We can't buy only EVs unless there's a way to easily charge anywhere you go. And the only way that happens is with massive public-private spending, which is the kind of thing that's in the Build Back Better bill. So for the auto companies to set these goals and then come out in favor of some of the spending, but not the whole bill, was, I thought, not only kind of immoral, it was actually stupid. Like, I actually think it was strategically dumb that they are going to be in a position where they can't meet the goals they've set. And they've moved away from like R&D in combustion engines. So they're like pot committed in poker terms. They're kind of all in, and they're not doing that positive advocacy. They're not going in and getting the policies that actually get us there.
Marty, another question?
Yeah. Do you think value creation from sustainability changes if regulations are enforced on companies versus if companies seek out innovation on their own? And if so, how?
I guess it depends on the problem. And look, government always has a role to set the guidelines, to set the playing field. Where are the borders? What are the referees, saying? When do you get a flag thrown on the play? Like, government has a role to play. So, it's a common phrase in policy to say, government shouldn't pick winners. And that's basically true. The best example is, setting a high fuel efficiency standard for cars, and then they go figure out how to do it. That said, we do need policies that radically quickly move us out of carbon. So we do have to kind of pick winners. Winners meaning lower carbon. You could do that by just pricing the hell out of carbon over time. That's how you just say, hey, it's a price, and then let people innovate. So I think it's both, right? The government has to set the standards, because the reason we don't do a lot of the things we need to now is because the things that damage our shared resources, the things that dump carbon in the air, are underpriced. We do not price the externalities. And I'm an economist and the economics degree in college. In those terms, we don't price the carbon we put in the air. We don't price the resources we use. So it's not a free market. It's a broken market. If we priced everything, things would move very differently. And that's just a really basic concept. So I think it's both setting the rules, pricing things, and then allowing innovation to flourish to get there as fast and as profitably as we can.
I think I would end there, Gary. There's a couple other questions, but we're at 7 o'clock.
Let's go one or two more if you've got them.
Okay, well, there was one, and I don't know. It says, does your book focus much on SDGs? Yeah,
so that's the Sustainable Development Goals, and actually, it was the other thing that came out the year of the kind of Paris Climate Accord was the SDGs. So we had basically twice in a year the entire world agreed to something, which had almost never happened in human history, which I think people don't realize quite how big a deal that was, really, to get to any agreement, even though it's not fast enough, we're not going to hold to 2 degrees, like all of that. It's still an agreement to do something. The SDGs came out, and they're the 17 goals that establish what a thriving world looks like. It's really 15 actionable categories. And then one is about peace, which Ukraine is proving now. Without peace, we can't do the others. And the 17th one is partnership. So there's kind of meta goals. But they established a pretty good list of what it would look like to have a thriving world. No hunger, everyone's got an opportunity for work, girls are all educated, we've tackled climate change, and on and on. Paul was actually, my co-author was the only private sector representative really on the committee at the UN. He was one of the few that was kind of trusted because there was a lot of skepticism of business. Mm-hmm. And the SDGs are kind of throughout the book. I mean, we talk about that being the lens. That is all of this pressure. The reason we have to go so much faster is we're hitting the thresholds of the world. The SDGs are a really good kind of business plan for living within those physical limits, and both the physical limits and the kind of moral and kind of human minimal standard that we should accept, which is everyone should have sufficiency, right? Everyone should have enough to have a shot, not go bankrupt because they get sick, like we've decided in the US is a good idea. That everyone's got a shot, and we have enough for that. We really do. It's just not distributed.
Andrew, are many companies paying attention to sustainable goals?
Yeah, I mean, it's much more, the SDGs they're talked about more in Europe and other places. They've definitely been used. If you look in sustainability reports, even annual reports, you'll see most larger companies now have done some kind of what they call materiality analysis. That's, again, kind of a financial term. It's about what things will affect the running cash flows, profits, whatever measure of the business in a material enough way that you should be disclosing that.
So and it's a good framework.
It's a frame, and they'll use that in their materiality analysis to say, here's the 4 or 5 things that we have the most impact in. If we're a food and ag company, the hunger goal is clearly one of ours, because you can't say all 17 are top priority for you. You're going to plug in certain ways. You have to have an impact on all of them, but I think there's a few in each company that really matter.
So, sounds good. Marty, one more?
Yeah, this was the very first question. And so I was asked specifically to ask it. Do you feel large companies can honestly reach net zero for all scopes, including scope 3, by 2040? So things like travel, employee impact, partner supplies, et cetera.
Well, I always kind of say yes because we have to, which is maybe a cop-out, but I kind of feel like we're working back from that now. That is what's finally changing in this discussion. It isn't just nice to have. It's like, oh, this is like a threshold. I think there's a lot of things moving exponentially. A lot of bad things happen. We saw what happens when a bug and a pandemic moves exponentially, how quickly. If you remember, we're almost exactly 2 years from shutdown. What happened between March 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, like the difference day to day was enormous because things were moving exponentially. We've seen population and emissions and everything move exponentially, but we're also seeing the accessibility of technologies, the price of clean technologies coming down exponentially. So clean energies are now basically the cheapest in the world. Batteries are coming down so fast that EVs are just going to be the cheapest. And so I do think we have the technologies and the ability to get pretty far. There's a few big things to solve, and there's sectors like steel and aluminum and cement that are incredibly energy intensive that there isn't a simple answer to, that require too much energy to just say, we'll put some solar on the roof, right? But there's real investment going on in that. I guess if I had to guess, we're not going to be at zero by 2040. We may not be at zero 2050. We may still be using some fossil fuels to fly. There could be a couple uses that are still needed. But I do think we can get to 100% renewable grid fundamentally, and we can get to 100% EVs. Like we can do it in massive portions, and there'll probably be a few lingering problems, which makes it so that scope 3 will be difficult for most. But again, we don't really have a choice, I think. I mean, we're making that choice every day in the wrong direction, but it's, there's only so far we can go down this warming path before it's just destroying too much of society to ignore. And we're going to be on a war footing with this the longer we wait, I think.
Yeah. Well, on that optimistic note,
Well, no,
think we
let
need
me just
to,
optimistically say that the technology change is really kind of remarkable, and people
Sure.
probably haven't realized how fast that's moving, how quickly we're moving to a cleaner, just a cleaner grid, a cleaner transportation system, healthier air. Like that's all coming.
Yeah, and the innovations out here really point that out. There are so many amazing ones that are happening. Marty, thank you so much for asking questions,
Thank you.
tracking the chat. We are near the end of the program, but Andrew, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time, staying up late back east.
No problem.
You go to bed now. And thanks everyone for attending. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Take
Bye-bye.
care.